So I'm going to be talking about a whole collection of costumes that belonged to our family and that my mother collected over the years. But before I come to those, I'd like to just sort of contextualize this. So often when you have cultures that are under attack, items of culture are so important to them maintaining their identity. So you have poems and costumes and even the style of people's houses. People maintain these as part of their remembered identity. So one could almost say that when you have lost the knowledge of these things, you've lost the memory of your culture and you've lost your culture altogether. So for some communities, such as the Palestinians, these items of identity are very important. And as we think about, as we're talking particularly on Palestinian costumes today, but if you think also in a broader sense, you have Afghan refugees escaping and wondering how to maintain their own identity. You have Ukrainians traveling vast distances and escaping at great speed. And one could wonder how they're going to maintain their sense of identity in places that they're not familiar with.
Okay, so let's start with a bit of poetry. We're talking about identity. This isn't a session about poetry, but it always never comes amiss to throw a bit of poetry in, and something by Mahmoud Darwish, who is, of course, the best known of the modern Palestinian poets, will not come amiss. Set the tone for the session. Write down, I am an Arab. I have a name without a title, patient in a country where people are enraged. My roots were entrenched before the birth of time and before the opening of the eras, before the pines and the olive trees, and before the grass grew. سجل أنا عربي أنا اسم بلا لقب صبور في بلاد كل ما فيها يعيش بفورة الغضب جذوري قبل ميلاد الزمان رصد وقبل تفتح الحقب وقبل الثروة والزيتون etc. etc. Well, let's leave it at that. There's more on the board if you can read it, but you'll get the idea. It rhymes in Arabic. It doesn't rhyme in English, but you still get, I think, a very powerful effect. And what we're going to talk about, or what Janet's going to talk about this evening, is sort of geared to this idea of identity.
So we begin with a picture of a vast number of different women, all celebrating International Women's Day. It was in 2016. And as you see, there's a whole range of Palestinian dress, though we can all normally identify all this as Palestinian. So it's all to do with what you mean by identity. I'm going to hope that the clicker works. Yes. It's interesting to realize that people are beginning to recognize the significance of items of dress, and UNESCO added Palestinian costume and embroidery to the list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. And this was reported on the 15th of December. So only very recently has it been recognized as being an important element of cultural heritage. And you see the lady on the right is wearing a very modern equivalent of Palestinian dress, but just to re-emphasize, this is tradition that has gone on and continued despite the history of Palestine. And just to quickly point out, in 1948, the state of Israel was created. And at that time, many Palestinians fled as refugees to surrounding countries and also in the wider diaspora, into the Gulf, into America, into South America, and so on. And then after the 1967 war, there was another wave of migrants, and many of them settled in Jordan, in refugee camps, and people who'd come from lots of different villages were all mixed up together and spread around. But items like poetry and costume were critical to people maintaining their sense of dignity, their identity, and the way they thought of themselves in their present condition. Originally, this collection of costumes you're about to see was displayed in the summer of 1995 in an exhibition held at the Oriental Museum in Durham as part of the Festival of the Middle Eastern Culture. There was a big display, including some other costumes, and it also included a session of poetry, which was quite intriguing because we asked an Israeli poet and a Palestinian poet to come, and both gave their poems at the same in the session, and it was very intriguing to see how often the metaphors and the symbolism of the poem resonated across the cultural divide. This is just for light relief, is our daughter at the time, in 1995, there, and her friends who decided to get dressed in some of these costumes. This collection that you're about to see was made by our parents, my parents, my brothers and my parents. My father was an international labour office expert who was in Palestine, in Jordan, from 1964 to 1971, my mother, who you can see there, was also working in Jordan, and she was a physiotherapist working with the Cheshire Homes, who were helping a lot of refugees get over some of their serious illnesses. And most of these costumes were collected in 1967 as people fled across the Jordan and moved into the refugee camps. There were people were selling their heirlooms, their family heirlooms in the sense of costumes, anything that they could just to survive. And my mother was involved in helping some of them sell their costumes. She was very friendly with many other people who interested in costumes, and you'll come to some of them in a minute. And so they made sure that the traditions were maintained. The people were selling all sorts of things. They were selling blankets and jewelry and all sorts of things. But my father knew Arabic, and he was going out teaching people about small-scale industries, how to manage your business, how to set up your workshop effectively, how to do your accounting. And he traveled all over Jordan, and before 1967, all over the West Bank. He did a lot of work in Nablus and Ramallah and these places. Well, we keep talking about Palestine, but what exactly do we mean? And of course, this is one of the issues. If you see the map of the Ottoman Empire, does this have a point? I don't know. This part here was Palestine, and it was part of the Ottoman Empire. So there weren't boundaries, there weren't restrictions on travel within the empire. And in that empire, you had people of many different nationalities. You have people there from the Balkans, people from right across down the Red Sea, and so on. And this map on the left is an old map from 1915 of Jerusalem in Ottoman Turkish. And as you see, there's no particular boundaries to the east at all. It's only bounded on the sea side. Now, just to look at some history of this. So we have this Ottoman Empire, which was very much a cosmopolitan environment. Of course, it always had its difficulties, but it was an area of lots of different nationalities. And when looking at some very old paintings and drawings of the area, you find some little images of costumes. And some of these resonate very well even today. You have the man from Aleppo in 1620 wearing his striped shirt. And I'm going to be showing you some pictures in a minute of somebody wearing something very similar in Jerusalem in the 70s. In the center is an intriguing jug, complete with pretend stitches on the handle, mimicking the idea of sewing, and also showing some of the many symbols that were very popular in the Turkish era, carnations and that sort of thing, which were critical, important symbols in the Ottoman world. And then the lady on the right is a rather large Greek lady wearing a yellow dress. And bear that image in mind, because you're going to find one very similar. That one was 1790. This one is probably early 20th century or even late 19th century. It's quite hard to find any images of dress in Palestine from earlier times. The earliest dresses that are known date back to about 1840. And this is a lady in an image by Abbé Albinos, showing a little lady, a lady of Jerusalem in her costume. But it's really quite hard to find these images. There's plenty of images of other parts of the Ottoman Empire, particularly, of course, around Istanbul, but not particularly of the Levant. But Palestinian costume does feature by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, because it was often used to illustrate biblical scenes. The idea that somehow you can reflect the biblical times by looking at what goes on in Palestine at the time was very popular, though not necessarily wholly appropriate. So you have two ladies here in a painting by William Brassey Hole, wearing costume that is probably from, simply set up in line with many of the Ottoman dresses. And then on the other side, you have at the beginning of photography, you start getting set up scenes, mocked up scenes of sort of biblical scenes here. This was a man and a woman of Ramla, sort of sitting as if they were part of a religious scene. And we've got to remember that this area that we're calling Palestine wasn't simply Muslim. There's a tendency today, one thinks of Palestine and think of the people who are fighting and all this sort of thing. But Palestine, at the time of the Ottoman Empire, was an area that was occupied by Jews, by Armenians, by Christians, by Muslims, by Circassians. It was a very cosmopolitan area. So you've got to remember that these people were actually living cheek by jowl, often in separate parts of a city, or say Jerusalem, but in fact were able to live alongside each other. And one would hope that eventually one day in the future that this pattern might become a reality once again. So before we look at all the costumes, I thought it would be a good idea to flick through at some pictures about some men's attire. Let's not leave men out of it, and the sort of environment in which people were living at the time when many of these costumes were being collected, were being made in the 1920s and 1930s particularly. I can't see this. Jerusalem is from the southwest. Was taken by myself in 1966. That's the picture on the left. And then this is an earlier picture, street scene of 1920, again in Jerusalem. Here's an archival picture of a coffee shop with a gramophone dating between 1890 and 1920, taken in Jerusalem. And again, you can see quite clearly the sort of garments that the men were wearing at the time. The fez, of course, was popular, very much a Turkish element. You have a man wearing a Bedouin outfit with a kafir nagal on his head, and a shirt and an overshirt. Somebody's smoking a hubble bubble, and very much wearing a sort of a gown on top of everything else. Here's a sweet shop in Jerusalem, again from the same period. Again, the fez is definitely there. On top, and people seem to be wearing European-style jackets, but with traditional garments underneath. And there's a gentleman reclining, I think that was taken in the 60s, wearing a sort of well-dressed man's outfit, complete with his leather belt and his European-style jacket, but wearing the Arab headdress again. Of course, the fez went out of fashion by the time that that was taken. And here's another group of pictures. Intriguingly, the picture that I took in summer 1997 on an excavation down in the Dead Sea Valley on the left, the man is wearing almost identical clothes as his predecessor sometime in Jerusalem in the 1890s and 1920s, where you see a porter carrying the trunks. So a sort of workman's outfits, at least until the 80s, hadn't changed very much at all. Although, as you see, the two people behind him are wearing what could be called European clothes. And so he was quite an elderly man, I think. And then you see two garments that are from the British Museum, which are similar to those that he's actually wearing. Now to come to the actual costumes, because I'm sure you're all dying to see these costumes. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the techniques and the idea of what these costumes are all about. First of all, this is a picture of a museum in Amman, in Jordan, and it's in a place called the Taraz Center. And it was a collection by one of the most famous collectors of costumes, Mrs. Wedad Kamal Kawar. She's still alive. She was born in 1931. And she was a friend of my mother's. And it was Mrs. Kawar who helped set up some of the collections at the British Museum and with Sheila Weir, and also was made a very large collection herself. Some of it was shown at the Institut du Monde Arabe. It's also been to Chicago. She's written lots of books about costumes, and she really is considered the real authority on these costumes. So this was originally set up in the amphitheatre, the pass of the amphitheatre in Amman, and it's since been moved to better location. Now, what are we talking about? These are Palestinian dresses. As you can see, the styles vary. Different shapes of sleeves. So you have some areas have very long and tapering sleeves. Some are quite short and tight. The shape of the neckline is different in various of each of all of these. The one in the center is one that probably dates from about 1965 to 70, beginning to be a change in the style of costume, where sort of amalgamation of all sorts of different styles because of the refugee camps. But the other two are distinct, and each area of what was Palestine had its own particular style of costume. They're always loose-fitting, very adaptable. If you look at them, some of these you'll see that they can be adjusted up and down at the waist, depending on your size or what you're up to. So that they also can be so that the main part was adjusted in the middle rather than at the bottom. The most complex dress came from Bethlehem. These are called robe de fête, thorpe malak. This is a velvet dress at the British Museum. It was the most complex. Some of each area, they had different shapes of these costumes. The Bethlehem one had 25 pieces to make up the dress, and the Ramallah dress, which we'll come on to in a bit, had 21 pieces. So if we start looking at the dress in more detail, we find it's not just a simple dress. It has a back panel, and the back panel is very important because that shows the quality of the dress beyond anything else. It has a yoke in the front. There are symbols of the embroidery, which I'll come to in a bit. There are side panels along the sleeves. There are side panels down this part of the dresses as well. Everything has a name, and each region has its own particular elements. So this is the elements of the Bethlehem dress, but other dresses have different combinations of these different elements. A lot of the embroidery is in cross stitch, but all sorts of other stitches are used. There's satin stitch and herringbone and all sorts of things. Traditionally, they used organic dyes until synthetic dyes came in as early as the 1880s, but not really in a large amount until about the Second World War, First World War. After about 1920s, you start to see the beginnings of aniline dyes rather than natural dyes. But the persistence of natural dyes continued, as you'll see when you start looking at some of these. And I also brought some pattern books, which you'll see if you want to leaf through these in a bit. So you can buy pattern books about different patterns in which to use. That, for example, is a pattern inside one of those books. The main experts are Mary Skinner, who was working in association with Mrs. Wadkawa and produced a book in 2017. Siham Abu Ghazala, who sadly died only a few months after her book came out. In fact, I don't think she ever saw the final version, wrote an excellent book called So to Speak. And then again, Mrs. Kawa wrote another book, Threads of Destiny. Her catalogue is in French. And if anyone wants to see it, I have a copy. But then the main authority really in this country is Sheila Weir, who wrote a book called Palestinian Costume. She had various exhibitions at what was then the Museum of Mankind of her costumes that she collected. And Mrs. Kawa was quite instrumental in helping her make these collections. There's now quite a few other collections around the world. There's a large collection in Jerusalem at the Israel Museum. There's strangely a large collection in New Mexico, in Santa Fe. There's a lady in Leiden who is collecting many embroideries, not just Palestinian embroidery. She has a vast collection and is still collecting. And it's called the Palestinian Heritage Foundation. Then there's various other collections in America. There's even a collection in Australia, which is the lady who runs that has been over and visited from time to time. And there's a new museum that is being developed in Washington. And we had a talk, my brother-in-law, organized a talk from the curator from that museum only a few weeks ago. There's also private collections in Amman and in Bethlehem. And there's also some drive by some Palestinian communities to try and get many more of the costumes relocated back in Palestine. But in a sense, it's not necessarily being that successful. So let's start having a look at some of the costumes. We're going to be doing a little tour of the different costumes, taking from the north of Palestine, right down towards the south and to Gaza and southern Jordan. So these are the groups we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at Galilee, then at Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Jaffa and Beit Dajan, Gaza and South Palestine. And then I'm also going to bring in something about the Circassians and Armenians, who were communities that also had some influence on the style of costume and also particularly on jewelry. And then I'll finish off with something about Bedouin in southern Palestine and Transjordan. So a few of these examples come from the British Museum. And the first group I'm looking at is from Galilee. This is quite intriguing. Well, the costume from Galilee is vibrant and exciting, and quite different sort of motifs from the rest of the things you're going to be seeing. This is a reversible coat, and it comes from the mountains near Galilee, and it's late 19th century. It's dyed in indigo. It's cotton dyed with indigo, and it's got silk taffeta patchwork, which is in little patches. Predominantly these patches are in red, yellow, and green, and they're made of silk. And they've also got on this costume, they've got ikat, and they've got satin, which is called atlas, which is often striped, and that's got stripes and patches along the front and on the sleeves. A lot of the costumes are based, at this time, they used indigo to dye the cotton. The indigo was grown in the Dead Sea Valley, in the Jordan Valley, as quite a profitable crop. And the more intense you use the dye, the darker it will go. But it has one drawback to use indigo. It's very difficult to wash a garment which has been dyed by indigo. In theory, you should be able to wash it in cold water, but I have one which I haven't brought, which I tried very carefully to wash, and the indigo ran all over the embroidery and it was ruined. So be careful if you have anything in indigo. Again, something from the British Museum. This is very typical style of coat from Galilee. You saw some of those sort of coats being worn by the old men in Jerusalem earlier. And this is a woman's coat. It's late 19th century to early 20th century. And this is what's called atlas. This is Syrian atlas fabric. And it's very much in the style of Turkish garments. It is very beautifully styled in that it just overlaps in the center very neatly, and it's got lots of different panels of material. Now we'll come to one that we actually have here. This is a woman's coat from Upper Galilee, probably from Safad. I bought it in Damascus in 1977, so it's about the most recent costume that I have. And it's black cotton fabric with cotton embroidery. The lining is Japanese cotton, which became quite a fashionable item, and plus some.
I think you need to move in front of the camera. Yes, we need to go to the camera.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. It's similar in style, as you can see, to the ones we've just been looking at, in that those bits overlap. And its motifs are quite sort of jazzy and modern. These are lanterns or something like that, and all sorts of triangles. There's trees of life. I have to turn it round and show the sleeves, maybe. and there's feathers and all sorts of different symbols, but a very sort of modern jazzy style. The material is a sort of satinized cotton. So you can't actually see the threads for anyone who's a good embroiderer. So you can't actually pick out the number of threads in which to stitch. So it's really very difficult to have made this, to embroider it. Then we come down towards the area around Nablus. This is an area which there isn't any particular style of embroidery. It's about the only area which isn't really, doesn't really have a particular fine quality embroidery. So this is a lady wearing an ordinary everyday dress, ploughing up in her olive groves. Now we move to Ramallah, and I'm also going to show you a few very ancient photographs. These are a lot of them from the 19th century or early 20th century. This is from 1905. And because of the style they were taken, they were these these ones that had a box and you put them in and you saw it in 3D. So you've always got two pictures on these slides. So this shows a father and the costumes of his sons in Ramallah. And this is a woman of Ramallah in 1900 wearing a chin chain, as you can see. We actually have one. Here. And now we're beginning to see very fine quality embroidery. Now, as I mentioned before, to look at a really good dress, you just turn it round to the back and look and see what the back panel is like. And this again is an example from the British Museum, where the back panel is made of linen fabric, and it's got this tall palm pattern, it was called, which was popular in Ramallah at the end of the British Mandate. Now, of course, I'm just suddenly mentioning the Mandate. After the end of the First World War, Palestine was controlled by the British, and from the end of the First World War until 1948. And therefore, you start to see some influences of British, at least military, symbolism coming through on the dresses, and you'll see that in a bit later. And there's a lady wearing a very typical jacket and headdress from Ramallah itself. This is a collection. This is another dress. This is a very ordinary dress. This is probably from the 1960s or 70s, and they're starting to use embroidery motifs that you find in European books of patterns. It's got butterflies and pigeons and parrots and vine leaves, and it's got it still has quite a good section at the bottom. If you can lift it up. So it's really quite a good quality one. It's seen better days. Its neck is slightly different from the usual pattern, and it's cut as a square rather than as a round. And that's an everyday dress, and this is another one which is an everyday dress. It's It's very much a new style dress, probably from around Bethany or Hebron. It's seen better days, and it's probably from the same period of time. Just simple with one, but again using European style embroidery motifs. There's again parrots and flowers, and it probably dates from about the 70s because suddenly the insets of crimpling under the arm, so presumably became fashionable to start using a bit of crimpling. The two scarves on the that you also see are also here somewhere. It's this one. This one. The top one was probably made in Ukraine or Poland at the time. Of course, it was all part of the Soviet Union, that part. And the bottom one was made in Kashmir and is in a color that's called acrylic fuchsia, which is rather vivid, as you can see. And it's still for sale in the 1980s at least. These ones are from the 1960s. So still a fashionable item. And those are worn round the waist, sort of rolled up, as you see them there. And then people would tuck their purses or any bits and pieces in the waistband to keep things safe. Now, the place of great magnificence of costumes is Bethlehem. And we've got several from Bethlehem, and you get a chance to look at them. This is made of striped velvet. The fabric was originally a design that was a flat weave material that was made locally, and then it's been copied by German craftsmen and then became quite a fashionable item. And this dates from about 1928, so it's nearly 100 years old. And it has, apart from the velvet, it has quite a lot of interesting panels of embroidery. This is made in Bethlehem, and it's the main stitch that's used is called couching, where you just have a thread and you catch it with a slip stitch on top of it. It has all sorts of, again, symbols, clocks and domes and all sorts of things. It has very fine side panels, but in fact it doesn't have much in the way of a back panel to mean that it's not a particularly good quality one, but it's obviously quite a good one. The next one we have is a purple ribbed fabric, a violet ribbed fabric that was made in Syria. The fabric was made probably in Aleppo or Homs. It's made with the silk warp and a cotton, black cotton weft, and the end result is a sort of watered finish. There's also some workshops in Damascus. Again, it's decorated with these couching panels with applique pieces, with velvet sections, with further embroidery, often with satin stitch on the embroidery. And this is rather a strange fabric because it's not normally used for dresses in Palestine. It became a short-term fashion to use it in Palestine because it was usually used for Orthodox priests' robes. And obviously somebody thought it looked good, it'd be nice. It was also used for lining for men's jackets at some time. So there was quite a short period around 1928 to 1930 where this was particularly fashionable to have this, use this strange fabric, which wasn't normally used for dresses at all. Now we come to one of the most extraordinary dresses. This is probably the oldest of the collection. It may even date back to the 19th century, at least in part. Again, it's fabric made in Syria. is embroidered silk, which is called garbani, and then it's been decorated with additional panels, which have been added later from Jerusalem, from Bethlehem. This fabric is actually, if you come and look at it later, you'll see there's two different sorts of this gold fabric. There's one which is gold on gold embroidery, and there's another one at the top here, which is white and gold embroidery on it. And this was very fashionable and was used basically as if you had a trousseau, this was supposed to be the one you would wear at your actual wedding at the time. But if you think back at the pictures I showed you earlier, there was a Greek lady sitting in a garment which was very similar to that, which was way back, right back in the 18th century. And although we haven't got any actual examples from that time, at least we can grasp from some of those early pictures what it might have been like and how it was continually used. It's got, this is all totally embroidered. It's got a central panel with a bit of plain, and then you've got these wonderful, very detailed panels on the bodice, on the sleeves, and on the sides. So that's probably the oldest one we have. Silk production was important in Syria and Mount Lebanon at the time, and silk thread was made until about 1955. And here's some examples of some very early photographs of weaving of Syrian silk on looms in Mount Lebanon district in 1914. And of course, silk was famous in Aleppo for centuries because that is the main entrepot for silk coming through from Iran, from Persia, through on the Silk Road, through coming westwards into Europe. And there's also many workshops and factories in Aleppo in particular, producing silk material, fabric as well, right back for centuries. So we're now here seeing the sort of last remnants of traditional silk production in the form of some of these dresses. There was a particularly weird style of dress that also occurs found in Palestine. If you look at the one on the left, this was an all-embracing garment, a sort of fine silk cloak, which again was made in Syria. It was very popular in the sort of 1920s in Palestine. There's one in the Oriental Museum in Durham, which is a very beautiful pale green turquoisey color, which looks very fine, and it's one very similar to one of those. Now we're coming to an early photograph of a woman from Bethlehem wearing a jacket, and hopefully the next pictures are not jackets. Yes, we've got those jackets. We've got two jackets, both from Bethlehem or Beit Jala, which is nearby. These copied 19th century models of costume, of jacket, and they were worn, as you saw in the previous picture, on top of the rest of the garment. She's got a dress there, which is very much in the style of the ones we've just been looking at, and she's then got a jacket on top. And in some ways they sort of copy military style garments. This is again couching work, again, and all sorts of different symbols. And decorated with silk cord and couching and filled in with satin stitch. Curiously, the inside seems to have been lined with some sort of fabric that was presumably made in Lancashire or somewhere like that. But sometimes they used, you start to find a fashion also of using Japanese cotton to line the jackets. And now we have another one. This one's blue velvet, equally lined in very unexciting material, but again, very fine couching on it. And there's quite a famous poem about a blue jacket by an American Palestinian author, which Paul's going to read.
Okay, Nathalie Handal, Palestinian living in America, and she writes mostly in English. If you come across anything in Arabic by Nathalie Handal, it's probably been translated from her English version by somebody else, which is a bit of a cheat, really. But this, I mean, this matches up so well with the jacket that we thought it was irresistible, really. The stars dust fall on the shoulders of the blue jacket, and as it slides down to the end of the sleeves, finds a place at the tower of my fingers. I let the asterisks discover the heart of the sheet and allow the ferries to travel wherever seaweeds and lanterns call them. I think of the love song in the back pocket of a martyr, the way he continued to walk slanted until the end of the smoke, and remembered the white and yellow pack of cigarettes sitting in his shirt pocket. I knew that I could find hiding colours in the curves of branches, but all the colours I wanted to see were in the blue jacket. Subways and war games were afternoon attractions for those who survived, but I still lived by the blue jacket's rules. After all, its threads healed the bruises on the child's feet and hid the only arak bottle from the invaders. The blue jacket, I continue to wear it so that I can remember the day I saw him in dewdrops, the day small ivory thorns found refuge in envelopes of letters going.
So, after the jacket, we have one of the finest bits of embroidery that there is in this collection. It's anybody who's a good embroiderer will know mille-point, this wonderfully, very, very detailed embroidery where it's almost impossible to see the stitches. It's really, really tiny. This is from, this is another of these wonderful sort of party dresses. I think in French it sounds so much better than just a party dress or a wedding dress, robe de fête. It's got a velvet yoke at the back. It's got incredibly fine work at the bottom, as you can see. And on the bottom, along the back panel, if you could show the back panel, you'll see there's a whole row of what look like triangles. These are in fact cypress trees with little buds along the edges of them. And that's a very common symbol that you find on many Palestinian dresses all across here. There's all sorts of other things, trees of life, vine leaves, all sorts of interesting motifs that you find on this. This is very, very fine work indeed. And on the shoulder, you'll see just there are little epaulets. This, of course, was made during the British Mandate, so you had symbols that related to what was going on around them. So this was obviously reflecting the military British mandates that was around them at the time. And those are vine leaves and trees of life and all sorts of things. Another dress which I don't have, this one belongs to one of my brothers. We divided up the collection between myself and my two brothers when my parents died. is an absolutely magnificent dress. It's made of red velvet, and it was the cloth was imported probably from France or Germany, French or was French or Germany, and it gradually became more popular than Turkish or Syrian velvet from about the 1930s in the Jaffa markets. Now, these red dresses, these red velvet dresses, were briefly very fashionable as part of a groom's contribution to the trousseau. But then gradually a blue velvet dress, almost identical to this, became more popular around 1935. So we know that this one must date to before 1935 because that was the fashion at the time. And you'd find that particular experts were specialists in these places like Bethlehem and Hebron and later Beit Dajan, which we'll come to, well, this is Beit Dajan as well, which were, you found there were specialists who were producing these panels of these embroideries for a sort of commercial market. So you get small scale production rather than all just simply being done at home. Because traditionally, to make a trousseau, this would be the work of a family. You'd have the mother and her aunts and the children and the wife, the bride would all be working for many years to produce a trousseau, which would include a whole lot of these dresses. So that one I don't have, but it's a very, very magnificent one. But I do have two other dresses. Now, from Beit Dajan. Beit Dajan was one of the most prestigious areas for making costumes. The nucleus Nathalie, and this was Thorpe Abiad white dress. And it has a whole lot of different motifs, include cypress trees and vases and flowers and feathers and almond branches and this rather intriguing symbol, which you see from the pattern sample there, called Irq al-Nafnuf, which literally means a branch of half-open buds. It's just a cross-stitch motif that's very common. You can see it in blue and green and orange in various panels. You also see lines of feathers. You see a whole center panel of flowers decorated with silver and white thread, little vases, all sorts of things. But this is probably one of the best of the dresses. Very detailed, beautiful work on the sleeves. It has a good panel at the back. Again, a whole lot of cypress trees, lots and lots of cypress trees. Cypress trees represented elegance, they represented death, they represented beauty. You think of very tall, slender cypress trees, and they were therefore used as a very popular symbol on dresses, which makes me think about the colors too, because you'll find that some of these costumes which are made for brides are full of vibrant and wonderful colors. But as people grew older, they were tended to use much more somber and dark colors. So it's also a reflection of generations and ages as you look at costumes as well. But these costumes weren't just worn for people's weddings. They wouldn't just wear them at one-off like we tend to in Britain, but would be people, if somebody went to a wedding or any sort of party, they would put these on as well. So you'd have lots of different generations wearing their robe de fête, which is why I prefer to call it just a wedding dress, because it would just go, it seems to be a nice idea really, doesn't it, to wear your dress on many more occasions. And then we've got one more of, there's some of more detail of it. That's some of the detail on the sleeve and on the yoke. These are called lulu, meaning pearls. These ones are artificial pearls, but I suppose a good one would have good pearls. And again, very carefully subtle colors that are carefully orchestrated and blended and created. and all sorts of extra bits of applique and patchwork, and embroidered patchwork, and a lot of use of silver thread and even gold thread. That was also produced in quantities in Syria and imported into Palestine. Then we have the last of these dresses from Beit Dajan, known as Nathalie. Again, this is from about 1929 to 1930, so they're nearly 100 years old, most of these. Again, as I mentioned before, my mother was involved with collecting and knew Mrs. Kawar, this famous lady who collected costumes. And I think they would discuss and share out costumes that they would acquire. And there's one, this is almost identical to one that Mrs. Kawar acquired and was dated back to 1929. She could actually date it because the embroidery, she even discovered who the embroideress was, somebody called Ibrahim, who lived in Beit Dajan. And she was almost producing them on a sort of commercial basis. But she later then moved to Amman and continued to do this work and was quite successful. So we know that this one was almost possibly identical to this one. So it must be about 1929. Again, nearly 100 years old. Again, this is the more typical of the Beit Dajan dress, which is in black rather than cream or white, as that one was. And you can see very clearly the beautiful embroidery with flowers and all sorts of panels and insets and all sorts of things. And there's another part of it that shows you the sleeve. Lots of, again, couching and thread work and silver threads and patchwork, very complicated. But again, like that one we saw earlier, it has little epaulets at each of the shoulders. There seem to be the shape of shields, again mimicking the military uniform of presumably of the British forces that were around at the time. Now we come to another group that one shouldn't forget, because as I said, it's not really that straightforward. We've got all sorts of different communities in Palestine, and there are two major communities that arrived during this period and earlier, which also brought their own styles of dress, which also, of course, influenced the styles of ordinary Palestinian people as well. And there's two particular groups that arrived of refugees. We've got to remember that there are refugees happening, right in the past as well as today. For example, the Circassians were driven out of the Caucasus into the Ottoman Empire by the Russians in the 18th century, and again from 1864 onwards. And you find that probably about 2 million refugees that fled Circassia. In fact, about 97% of Circassia was cleared of people, of Circassians. And they settled, particularly in Palestine, they settled throughout Asia Minor, they settled in Transjordan, and brought their own styles. Another group of refugees that came to Palestine just a bit later was in 1918. Well, again, they fled from Asia Minor, and that's a group of them on a train. And there's another group of them. As you can see, that their costumes have got some similarities to what we've been seeing already, in the sense of the fez and the garments the women's wearing and the head shawls and so on. So some of their patterns and their embroidery motifs, again, started to get incorporated into Palestinian costumes as well. Here's a group of Circassians. There's now a large group of Circassians that live almost separately around Galilee, and this is their costume. And again, for them, it's important as a sense of identity to retain their traditional styles of dress as part of their cultural memories. And so that you can see, and again, some of these styles were shared by other people in the Ottoman Empire, because we were from the Ottoman Empire, and from coming across through Asia Minor, but also had influences on other costume in the region. Particularly, the Circassian Armenians produced this particular sort of silverware. And I've got several examples here you can see later. There's a pendant, an amulet box there on the left, decorated with this black sort of like enamel sort of stuff. And then it's got all sorts of coins that date back to the Ottoman Empire. Then there's on the right, there's some bracelets, again, very typical. Many of these were made in Amman and also down into Transjordan in places like Karak, where there was a lot of Circassians and Circassian workmen. And this is at the bottom is a belt that was owned by one of my brothers. Was again also a piece of Circassian or Armenian work that dates to at least before 1925. And it's got inset stones and so on. He wears it with his kilt, I must admit. But it was quite interesting to see how these Bedouin Circassian chiefs were beginning to get involved in the local life of the region. This is quite an intriguing picture taken in 1921, just the beginning of the British Mandate. And amongst those people you see is T. Lawrence, who's second from the right, and various members of the Circassians and Bedouin communities. So they were beginning to be on the same level of importance. And there you have them wearing their traditional Circassian outfit. The man in the middle can be seen as quite distinct from the Bedouin gentlemen around. And then there seem to be some British people wearing quite extraordinary outfits, some of which look as if they're half Arab and some topies and all sorts of things. Now, just the final group to talk about are those groups in the south of Palestine and into Transjordan. We've got one, of course, there are some towns, and this is from the southern coastal plain. This is the last of the main dresses, from a village near Gaza. So we've moved south. Again, it's from about 1930. And again, Mrs. Carrar had a hand in the collection of this, I think. It's very much got appliqué work and very fine embroidery, but it's got tight sleeves rather than those loopy ones that we saw before. And it's mainly got flowers. It's got roses and carnations and very fine work. This is very typical of this region. Again, a different style from the other dresses, though it has some of the same elements. It has this central panel of these particular colors that you would normally expect to find. Just a few pictures, of very early pictures of the Bedouin themselves. This is a Bedouin from the Beni Hassan camel herders who roamed in southern Palestine and Transjordan. This is from 1898. This is quite an extraordinary picture. These dresses were worn in some parts of the southern areas of Palestine amongst the Bedouin, and they are as tall and as long as that carpet there is there. And they would be looped up, so you'd have two or three thicknesses, and then you looped up around the waist. And then, so you'd have several thicknesses of dress. So they're rather strange dresses. These were at a wedding near Jericho. And now for the final thing that we're going to show you, I think it is. The picture on the right is a lady wearing a face mask. So you can just about distinguish her eyes. She comes from northern Sinai, and she's wearing a face mask which is decorated with all sorts of beads and bracelets and so on, but she's wearing this sort of thing. This is Paul bought this in Al Arish, which is northern Sinai, and we managed to track down the coins. Some of them are Ottoman, some of them are from short-lived kingdoms as far as Luxor and all sorts of places, and the colours and the beads all reflect different aspects of life, bringing fertility and success and good luck and all sorts of things. So that is actually one of those, and that's a picture of somebody actually wearing it. And again, so we've got some examples of sort of Jordan, southern Jordan and southern Palestine jewelry that was being worn by somebody's Bedouin. This is a picture I took of friends who were Nawafli, Hawatat Nawafli, which is a Bedouin group who've settled in Wadi Musa, which is now a village outside Petra, wearing, as you see, rather a variety of costumes. She was wearing a black velvet dress decorated with flowers. He's wearing a very typical Bedouin outfit with a proper cloak and a heavy belt, his kafir in the right position. The man on the right is wearing a much more sort of military style outfit. And I've got two more slides. One Paul's going to read.
Yeah, we started with Mahmoud Darwish, so let's almost end with Mahmoud Darwish. And this is a very short extract from a poem, but it's been revived in the present circumstances of Ukraine. People are using it to talk about Ukraine, just as it was used to talk about Palestine several decades ago. So it's an example of heritage poetry making a leap from one set of circumstances to another. The war will end. The leaders will shake hands. The old woman will keep waiting for her martyred son. That girl will wait for her beloved husband. And those children will wait for their hero father. I don't know who sold our homeland, but I saw who paid the price. ستنتهي الحرب ويتصافح القادة وتبقى تلك العجوز تنتظر ولدها الشهيد وتلك الفتاة تنتظر زوجها الحبيب وأولئك الأطفال ينتظرون والدهم البطل. لا أعلم من باع الوطن ولكنني رأيت من دفع الثمن.
And just to reinforce this, I've added a picture of at the bottom of the English, and this is a Ukrainian embroidered motif, and it is very, very similar to the Palestinian one that I called Erk al-Dafnu. And just to end, that's the back of that very great jacket.